I'm going to introduce my colleague from Columbia University, Stephane Charitos. He leads the Language Resource Center there. I've known him for quite a number of years and have known him to be very willing to pose provocative questions and throw out interesting solutions and raise really good issues. And that's exactly what we've invited him to do here this afternoon. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming him, and I hope you enjoy his talk.
Thank you, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Kathy and Emily, as well as the organizer of the shared, less commonly taught language symposium, for asking me to talk and giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. Can you hear me? I'm having a problem. I think the time might be. How's that? Can you hear me better? Maybe I should even take it off. Huh? How's that? There's a reason why I never wear ties. Let me begin by saying I don't know how many of you were present in May at the Chicago Language Symposium this year. If you were, you might remember that I gave a talk there in which I offer some thoughts on the current state of language education in the U.S. Much of the data which informed my comments at the time originated from the 2016 MLA preliminary report on enrollments in languages other than English. I had hoped, and I had spoken to Dennis Looney about this when I saw him in New York, that as promised by the author, there might have been an update to that report by the end of the summer, and this would have given us a more granular look at the data. Unfortunately, to date, this update has not been published, so my comments today will reiterate many of the points I made back in May, or in April actually, and I apologize for that. I will, however, try to be more succinct in order to give us more of an opportunity to have a discussion about some of the things I talk about. Let me begin, as I usually begin, with a couple of anecdotes. I was in Holland this summer giving a talk, and at some point I went to get lunch in a restaurant. And the waitress came up to me and asked me if I wanted to see a menu in Dutch or in English. And since I was feeling mischievous, I switched into French, and I told her in French that I would like to see a menu in French. She didn't miss a beat. She switched into French herself and said, "Mais bien sûr, il n'y a aucun problème." That brought to mind this little episode of linguistic nimbleness. Brought back to mind another incident which occurred many years before when I was an undergraduate at the University of Arkansas. I was at a party, I was talking to this girl, and during our conversation I mentioned I was from France. She said, "France, you're from France? That's so cool. You speak French." And for a couple of seconds I thought, I was taken aback, and I felt like telling her, "No, I speak Italian like everyone else in France." But then I did acknowledge that I did indeed speak French. I don't recount these episodes, these anecdotes, in order to disparage one culture or praise another. Instead, I bring them up to highlight some of the fundamental differences displayed towards foreign languages and foreign cultures between the US and Europe. Rather than being benign or innocuous, these differences highlight a far more depressing truth. The fact that far fewer Americans care to learn something about the rest of the world than their European counterparts. Despite being a racially diverse country where over 350 languages are spoken on a daily basis, the US is filled with millions of people who speak English and only English, and who show little to no interest in studying another language. And it does seem that this situation is not bound to get any better anytime soon. The election of President Trump to the presidency, in conjunction with a growing protectionist sentiment in the US, the imposition of harsh immigration policies, and the reappearance of English-only rhetoric, all give the impression that the United States is not only turning its back on the world, but that Americans are fine with and even proud of actively ignoring any language other than English. As we will see in a moment, both last year's report from the Commission on Language Learning and the 2017 report from the nonprofit American Council for International Education, as well as the newly released MLA report on language enrollments, all make it quite clear that as a nation, the US is faced with a rapidly deteriorating ability to interact with the rest of the world in any language other than English. It is against this background that we must examine the state of language study in the US and ask some tough questions about its future. What I want to do with you today is threefold. First, I want to share some data that summarizes and contextualizes the current situation of foreign language education in the US at both the institutional and the societal context. Having presented the numbers that sketch out the broader picture, I next want to outline a number of issues which, in my opinion, directly affect the role foreign languages are called to play, or not, within the context of higher education in the US today. Finally, I will end by discussing a number of practical recommendations that could help us formulate specific policies to address the challenges we face in upholding the visibility and importance of language education, particularly at the institutional level. But before I start, let me perhaps explain why I speak of language education in general and not more specifically of LCTLs, even though I understand that this conference is concerned primarily with LCTLs. Well, the first reason is, oops. All right, what happened here? There we go. The first reason is because LCTLs, while important, are but a small part of a much larger picture. In other words, they're only the tip of a much larger iceberg. If we look closely at the data, we see that LCTLs, and I'm using the MLA definition of LCTLs here, which is any language other than the 15 more commonly taught languages in the US. LCTLs account for a little over 2% of total language enrollment in 2016, about 35,000 students. That's a paltry 0.2% increase from the 2013 figures. The data only shows that 3%, so if you want to look, so here's the total enrollments. You'll notice that enrollments over 1,000 exist in only 9 languages. An enrollment of less than 100, number 189. Enrollments in the LCTLs are also characterized by both extreme volatility and vulnerability. So 97 languages are taught at a single institution. 164 languages are taught at 3 institutions or less. And 43 languages were dropped since 2013, and 44 new languages were added. So you have extreme volatility, and you don't have durability. Okay? So that's one of the backgrounds and one of the reasons why I want to talk about languages rather than LCTLs. There's also looking at the total counts of institutions that teach languages. There's only 3% of all institutions of higher education surveyed in 2016 offered instruction in more than 15 languages. 70% offered instruction in 6 languages or less. So when we're talking about LCTLs, we're really talking about the tip of the iceberg here. And we really should be talking about what's under the surface. And that's the second reason, because while LCTLs are undoubtedly important, particularly to these institutions like my institution that have a global research presence, an institution like mine have historically provided the bulk of instruction in the LCTLs. The specific challenges and problems associated with the instruction provision of LCTLs are simply not consequential to the vast majority of those teaching languages today. That's not to say or in any way demean or disparage the excellent work accomplished under very trying circumstances by those engaged in the teaching of LCTLs. It's simply meant to acknowledge a reality. However, one can also think of lictals, and this is the second point I would like to make, like a canary in a coal mine. By that I mean that while it may seem at first that only lictals are in a vulnerable institutional position, I believe that many, if not all language programs, will in due course have to face the same constraints that lictals are facing, since they are all more or less equally affected by the challenges posed by broader forces that are shaping what euphemistically has come to be called the nation's language deficit. Lastly, I believe there's an urgency today that compels us to take a more systemic look at the condition under which all languages, and not just lictals, are offered in university settings. When overall language enrollments nationwide are dropping, when advanced level enrollments are down, when the number of language majors are down, when funding and jobs for language education are down, when the use of adjuncts is up, and when language departments are being shuttered and program closed, I think we urgently need to have a serious discussion about the long-term fate of language education at a time when there are both shrinking resources to support them institutionally and growing skepticism about their overall worth in a societal setting. So, having said that, let's look at some data. As I said, I want to begin by looking at data from 3 sources. This is the first one. In 2014, a bipartisan group of members of Congress asked the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to undertake a new study of the nation's language educational needs. In response, they produced a report titled America's Languages, Investing in Language Learning for the 21st Century, which I highly recommend you should read. The report takes a critical look at the state of language education in the U.S. and concludes that the U.S. has neglected languages in its educational curricula, its international strategies, and its domestic policies to the point that it can no longer prepare citizens who can compete globally in the 21st century. In particular, I want to highlight 3 of the report's findings. The fact that despite its long history as an immigrant nation, only 20% of the total population speaks a language other than English at home, and that only half of them are considered proficient in reading, writing, and speaking a second language. So it means out of a population of 320 million, we're talking at perhaps 30 million Americans are proficient at speaking another language. The fact that only a small percentage of these 30 millions, 16.3% of those who reported speaking another language acquired that language at school. That means that they're not picking up a language in our classes. They're picking up the language at home. Okay? And we know that by the 3rd generation, they would have lost that language. And the fact that this is the 3rd fact I want to highlight, the fact that there is a critical shortage of qualified foreign language instructors or teachers in the U.S. And this means that this unfortunate situation of us not teaching the next generation will not improve over time and will continue to deteriorate unless something is done to fundamentally address this deficit, the fact that there are no teachers. We're not training teachers. Let's look at the next report. Last year, a national survey, the National K-12 Foreign Language Enrollment Survey, sponsored by the Language Flagship at the Defense Institute, the National Security Education Office, published data on the state of language study in the U.S. across the K-12 continuum. Looking at the data, one can only say that the outlook for language education in the U.S. classroom is dismal. Despite a growing population, and the American population is growing, okay? And despite a growing population of Americans who speak a language other than English at home, and I'll talk about demographics later on in my presentation, only about 20% of the total U.S. school-age population is enrolled in a language class or in a language program. Moreover, enrollment rates vary widely from state to state, with some states, Arizona and Arkansas, for example, reporting that fewer than 10% of students are studying world languages. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that Spanish continues to be the most popular language, with enrollments totaling more than all other languages combined. So there is no diversity in what we teach at the K through 12 level. There are some emerging news that could be considered good. The popularity of Chinese language learning is soaring across all of the US in K through 12 settings. It ranks at the 4th most widely taught foreign language in the country educational system. And we now offer Chinese courses in every state except South Dakota. So Chinese is, to a certain degree, a success story. I should have switched. So you can see here, one of the other problems is that none of these languages except Chinese perhaps and Arabic, are on what the US considers to be a critical language list. Okay? So we're simply not training people in critical languages at all. It's also interesting that 8 times more students take Latin than Arabic in the K through 12 setting. So again, that should tell you something. In comparison, let me point out that learning a foreign language is nearly a ubiquitous experience for students throughout Europe, with a median of 92 students of primary and secondary school students across Europe learning at least one other language in school as part of their education. Furthermore, studying a second foreign language for at least 1 year is compulsory in more than 20 European countries. You also see that 64% of all Europeans, if I can find this, consider themselves to be bilingual. And this is not something that you see in this country. Finally, I'm going to skip to the 2016 MLA report. It released its preliminary report on enrollments earlier this year in March. Aggregated course enrollments in languages other than English were about 1,400,000. That's down from 1,600,000 roughly in 2013. Until recently, and I had been speaking to MLA people, the hope had been that the figures that the organization had reported in 2013, so in 2013 they reported a drop, that showed an overall enrollment course falling by 6.7%. They had hoped that this was an aberration, and nothing but an aberration, an anomaly, and that the system would eventually go back to its quote-unquote normal state. We now have a 9.2% drop since 2013. The second largest decline in the history of the census. This clarifies any uncertainty we might have had. What we are experiencing now is not a brief statistical fluke, but the continuation and even acceleration of a sustained downward trend. Enrollment dropped in all languages in the top 15, with only Japanese and Korean showing modest improvement. Here, you can probably see it better here. You see that all languages dropped. The only 2 languages that showed a modest improvement were Japanese and Korean. And when I talk about modest improvement, I'm talking about 3,500 students nationwide. That's the improvement we're talking about. The decrease in enrollment has affected all European languages, including Spanish, which is down almost 10%, French over 11%, German 7%, and Italian over 20%. Even languages that had hitherto been growing robustly, Portuguese, Chinese, Arabic, and so forth, are losing ground. Enrollment is also dropping, or is anemic at best, in most of the languages that the US deems to be critical to its national security. There are 3 Tajik learners in the country. Yeah. The number of Pashto learners is less than 100, probably less than 40. Okay? That's the situation. It also shows us the uniformity in the languages students pursue. French and Spanish continue to dominate language offering nationwide, in terms of ranking, was 62% of all students enrolling in these two languages alone. But for me, perhaps the most striking statistics are the following three. The fact that the ratio of students enrolled in language courses in relation to the total number of students enrolled in post-secondary education in the US fell to 7.5%. This thing. That almost matches the low point we've had in 1980 of 7.3. That means that 7.5, let's say 8 students out of 100 are studying a language. Okay? Because this means that the overall language demand is dropping, even as the overall number of students enrolling in institution of higher education is growing. So even though we have a growing total population, the number of students who are taking language courses are dropping to near historical lows. Okay? The second thing is that with the notable exception of Korean, you'll see Korean right here, which went from all most commonly taught languages showed especially sharp declines in enrollments at the advanced levels. It's unclear why this is happening at this particular time. Why are we having this loss of upper division enrollments? Is it because institutions are cutting language programs and therefore students can't continue? They have limited options for advanced studies? Or is it because students are not enrolling in courses offered? It could be one of the two. But the fact remains that fewer and fewer students are pursuing their language studies to the point where they can make a meaningful usage of the language they're learning. They're basically fulfilling the language requirement, if there is a language requirement, and dropping out of the language programs. The third point I wanted to make is that the number of institutions reporting offerings no language programs at all is steadily climbing. We went from 176 to 219. So more and more institutions are simply cutting their language programs entirely. So how can we summarily, or how can we succinctly summarize what all this is telling us? Because it's not enough to look at data. You still have to make sense out of it. You still have to go under the hood to find out what's going on. In my opinion, and as someone, my first training was as an economist, what the data is saying is that the language education is facing a chronically depressed demand curve. As the data clearly shows, demand for language instruction at institutional post-secondary education is anemic at best and declining at worst throughout every point of the entire curve, and not just for the last 3 years. Here's the same data, and I've calculated what's called a regression line that takes care of the deviations from the little deviation from one point to the next. When you calculate a regression line and you plot it historically against the available data, you can clearly see the general downward trend. So even though it seems to have picked up a little bit, the trend is downwards, and it's steadily downwards, and it's been so since the beginning. Okay? All this means is that language education in the US is rapidly becoming like ikebana, the exquisite Japanese art of floral arrangement, the rarefied specialty of a happy few. And unless we find ways to successfully deal with the issue of student enrollment, student recruitment, and perhaps more importantly, student retention, it really won't matter what we do with dialectos or with languages in general. We need to find ways to attract students, to enroll these students, and to retain these students. Otherwise, we could be talking about less or more commonly taught languages. We won't be talking about languages anymore. As someone who dreamed of being a mathematician in high school, that's what I wanted to be. I remember that one of my mentors once told me about a particularly challenging equation in differential geometry, before one can begin to offer a solution to a problem, one must understand the roots of the problems itself. So with that in mind, I think, and this is the second part of my presentation, there's a number of factors we can point to that are negatively impacting language studies in the US in a significant way. I'm going to go over this rather briefly. Many of them are self-evident. Do keep them in mind, because when I talk later on about advocacy, these are the points that you have to address, both at the institutional level and at the societal level. So, here are some of the reasons why I feel, language education is where it is in the US. Nativism. There's a lack of interest in other cultures and other languages in this country, and that lack of interest is growing. I'll leave it at that. Many Americans see English as a lingua franca. Why should we learn another language when other people are learning English? The fact that they're learning English protects us from having to learn their language. That's a growing sentiment, which I hear a lot from students I speak to. We know America, this is, language learning is time consuming, and we're the impulse society. We want what we want, and we want it now. We don't want to wait. We don't want to have to work for it. We're the society that has same-day delivery, that has movie streaming, on demand, instant feedback from your followers on social media. We don't have time. So I think that's also impacting one of the reasons which I hear from students. Language education takes time, it's repetitive, you have to keep doing it, and it's never over. You constantly have to be working at it. Globalization. One would think that globalization would be something that would help language instruction. Unfortunately, as the federal government has shown by cutting language money from language program and putting it into these global education in English program, one can globalize in English. And this is the approach that we're taking. That when we talk about globalization in this country, we're talking about globalizing in English. There's a very public rhetoric about the need to prepare students to be global citizens of tomorrow, yet more and more people, both inside and outside academia, are questioning to the degree to which engaging with the languages or culture of the rest of the world is really necessary. Since they're learning English, if we want to be global, we can just do it in English. In particular, though, I wanted to point out some of these which are really affecting what's going on. STEM education. A lot of our students now, because this feeds into the debate about what is the role of an institution, what is the role of a university. Is it to educate citizens, or is it to train students for work, for the job market? And for many students, the decline that we're seeing in language enrollment is part of a larger trend away from the humanities in favor of more applied, career-oriented courses and majors. And so we also have to tackle this within that broader kind of perspective. There's the corporatization of the university. So when we see the decline in language enrollments, it comes at a time when a culture inherited from the corporate world is actively reshaping almost every part of higher education. And not only are they introducing new bureaucratic and management structures, which are controlled by a cast of emerging professional administrators, but they're also bringing methods of operation that have traditionally played no role in how we conducted our affairs. And in particular, I'll mention metrics. There's an obsession with metrics. If it's not measurable, it doesn't exist. And unfortunately, the only metric we have been able to present have been enrollments, and those are not good. So we need to think about what other metrics we may be able to provide. Accountability, that's a societal problem. More and more calls have been growing in the last couple of decades for increased accountability and transparency at colleges and universities. There's a widespread feeling amongst students, parents, government, and the general public that higher education is not delivering value for money, and that college and university should be accountable for administrative and academic activities. I think that's particularly widespread in public institutions. We're a little bit more protected at private institutions, but it's there as well. In such an environment, it's harder for language programs to be appealing, unlike programs and degrees that focus specifically on developing skills for the workplace. Budgetary pressure. I can see you looking at me and saying, Columbia, what kind of budgetary pressure do you have? We have budgetary pressure, like everyone else. Since 2008, spending on public colleges and universities has remained well below historic levels. There's only 3 states that have upped their spending from what they were spending in 2008. The other 47 are still spending less than they were spending in 2008 on higher education. One of the consequences for language study is that many institutions have used the budgetary crisis as an excuse to cut back on their overall commitment to language ed programs. And these cutbacks have not only skewed the playing field away from foreign language education as a whole, they've also exacerbated the institutional rivalries between foreign languages by pitting languages currently in demand against languages that may be in less of a demand as they compete for their share of an ever-shrinking budgetary pie. I talked to the budget director of Columbia, and I said, is this true for us? He said, it is partly true. We are back to our spending levels of 2008 and even above. However, we have revised the way we are thinking about our endowment. We used to think our endowment was growing at 15 to 17% a year. We've completely revised this, and so that means that as they project forward into the future is not as rosy as it used to be, even for us. I don't want to belabor the point here, but these are some of the reasons. There are probably others that are affecting language education in general. And as I said, if you're going to be talking about advocacy, these are some of the things you're going to have to be addressing to the people who are making decisions. What can we do about this? I've been in this business for over 30 years. And year after year, I go to conference, and I hear from colleagues who invariably express the same frustrations. Administrators don't appreciate, they don't value the importance of teaching and research in the languages. Our voices are either systematically ignored or we're not sufficiently heard. And the future outlook for language education in the US is grim and getting grimmer. However, I've also noticed that these moments of frustration seldom go beyond griping and complaining. It seems that as a profession, we have embraced a debilitating mindset that asserts that despite the dire straits in which we find ourselves, there is very little we can do to affect the status of language learning at our institution. Yet, if we are to have a future as a profession, I believe it is vital that we respond to the concerns of students, their families, university administrator, and the wider public about the concerns they have about language education in general, and educate them about why language education does matter. And I think our response must focus on showing empirically and convincingly that language programs are delivering what they say they are delivering. So we have to say, if we're saying that we're doing X, Y, and Z with our students, we have to show that we are actually doing that. But more importantly than showing that we are doing what we say we are doing, we must forcefully demonstrate why the very kind of knowledge we produce is indispensable to the business of academic learning and to society at large. So it's not enough to say that we're doing a good job. We have to prove to them that the job we're doing is worth doing. I think this is where this game is going to get played. There is an urgent need, one would say a critical need, to move forward with a concerted effort to change the negative perception associated with language education institutionally as well as societally. In economics, when you have a sharp fall in demand, some possible responses can include any and all of the following: the redesign of the product, the opening of new markets, the launching of a new advertising campaign, or the establishment of alliances to share costs and expenditure. So I'd like to inspire myself from economics and propose a multi-pronged approach that addresses the various challenges we face in upholding the visibility and importance of language study at the institutional level. And I'm going to propose 4 discrete yet overlapping axes. It means that you can't just work on one of them, you have to work on all 4 of them at the same time. Inform, advocate, innovate, collaborate. I want to look at each of them in turn. By inform, I mean both giving and gathering better information. Before we mount any information campaign, before we mount any campaign to try to convince students, administrators, and the public of the importance of language learning, it seems to me that we need to collect more meaningful data than what we currently have available. Enrollment data provides a broad standard measure that gauges language interest, but it's simply too crude a tool to properly inform our knowledge of our students' motivation. It's always surprised me, and I've been in this business for 30 years, we know surprisingly little about why our students decide to study a language, why they choose one language over another, or what they do with a language skill post-graduation. We simply don't bother to ask. So the first thing we need to do a better job of surveying our students and try to get a better understanding of why they're studying or not studying a language or a particular language. We also need to mine existing data more carefully. We need to look beyond raw enrollment data and more closely study the divergent fate of various language programs, insofar as this can provide a different insight in the situation than simple enrollment figures. While some programs, many programs, are dramatically losing students, in some cases without apparent explanations, other programs are growing. This means that certain programs are doing things right, at least for themselves. We need to learn from their successes and widely disseminate and emulate their practices. I'll show you a little bit of what I mean. I'll come back to this. I've done some data mining at Columbia, going back to 2000. These are the top 15 languages that we teach. You'll notice that apart from the languages in red, we basically follow the MLA top 15. So one of the questions I would ask my administrators and my colleagues is, why do we have these 2 additional languages? And for example, where does this come from? Yeah. Why has this materialized in the last 6 years, 8 years? What happened with Yiddish? We used to be the top Yiddish teaching institution in the nation. It's now dropped out of our top 15. Greek used to be ranked as highest 4. What happened? By Greek, I mean ancient Greek. It's dropping. So you have to look and start looking at data more granularly. So I would urge you all to do this at your own institution. The other question I would ask is, where's the data before 2000? They couldn't come up with it when I asked for it. Interesting. Here's our annual language enrollment from 2000. Wow, what a drop. But sometimes, this is an optical illusion scale. If you draw a regression line, this is where our language enrollments are. And this is just a scalar optical illusion because of the scale. But still, we've had a decline of about 12% since our peak. So there is a decline. You can see this better if you look at it like this. If you change the scale, you see that it's pretty flat. But more importantly than that, when you mine the data further, here are our top 15 languages. They're about 92% of all our enrollments. it means that the other 40 languages we teach about 55 languages in Columbia. The other 40 languages are about 8% of our total enrollment. I ask questions from one perspective. I can tell you administrators are looking at this from another perspective. Do we really need to be teaching 40 languages to 8% of the students taking languages? And perhaps this is also interesting. These are our top 2 languages, which happen to be Spanish and French. They're about 45% of total enrollments, and that has been pretty much steady. Okay. So these are the kinds of data mining that you should do with your data. It's important to understand the data and understand granularly what it's telling you, as opposed to looking at national averages or national data. And I think everyone should do this, and then we should come together and talk about our own data. Once we've done this, I think there's an acute need to both increase the visibility of language and manage belief about language education amongst those that matter the most. The students and their parents. The students are in your class, their parents tell them what to do, kind of, most of the time. So the overall of any campaign to inform should be both to promote the value, the importance, and the benefit that can result from a language education. So you want to stress the positive things that you see, as well as address common misconceptions about language education that end up portraying it as a problem to be eliminated rather than an asset to be praised or to be prized. So you want to both inform what's good about language education, but at the same time, you want to make sure you address misinformation that may be out there. It's been my experience that the most effective promotion for languages, especially for the lictals, comes through the sharing of our students' personal experiences. Successful students attract other students into a class. Okay? Any informational campaign about language education should publicly call attention to the value and the transformative power of language learning in our students' life through the collection, curation, and distribution of personal stories. I just got one yesterday. I didn't have time to put it here. Girl who took 2 semesters of Ukrainian and is now working on Ukrainian radio in the Ukraine. That's the kind of story that appeals to students. 2 semesters and she's working on Ukrainian radio. Great, you know. So we need to use these stories to showcase values, arguments, and experiences that are most relevant to our students and highlight the ways in which languages has made a difference, transformed a life for the better, or otherwise positively impacted them. We need to coordinate these stories and we need to disseminate them widely using social media tools. That's what students use. Doing campaigns that appeal to us doesn't appeal to students. We need to appeal to them in a language that they understand. I understand that many of us are not comfortable carrying out these activities, but it's crucial, in my opinion, that we find ways to cut through the noise in order to position language education in ways that engender support and participation. The future of language education may well depend on our ability to sufficiently communicate the relevance of languages today to those who are, quote unquote, voting with their feet. The last thing I will say is that we need to, and I put 2 campaigns here where we're starting to let students tell their stories. One at Michigan State and one at Columbia for the Shared Course Initiative. It's one of the ways that we found that we attract more and more students in the Shared Course Initiative. I'll say a few words about it by letting students talk about how it's transformed their approach to language teaching or to language learning. The last thing I will say about informing is that we need to have a unified message about language education, not a specific pitch for a particular language. So the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you're talking about the value of language education in general before you pitch for your own language. Because a rising tide will lift all boats. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're competing with other languages. And you don't want to be competing here. You want to be working together to make language education more visible at your institution, because that will bring more students to each and every language programs. So that's what I wanted to say about informing. I want to talk a little bit about advocacy and advocating. Informing and advocating are closely related, and sometimes you can go from one to the other. But I think advocacy differs from the simple gathering and dissemination of information in two significant ways. One, it targets a specific group of people who are seen as decision makers. And two, it aims to influence their decision in order to effect positive change. So you're not simply informing people, you're actually trying to get them to change their behavior. We know, as language professionals, that there are enormous personal, professional, and societal benefits to learning another language. The challenge we face is how do we communicate these rich and significant benefits to those who are in decision-making capacity at our institution, as well as the government level, both state and national. For many administrators, the real value of learning a language is something of a black box. I know this from talking to my boss, who's a really nice guy. I'm a statistician, what do I know? More often than not, it seemed that those who decide or share in the decision about language program at the institutional levels are not as well informed about the benefits associated with language learning as they could be. I think it's our job to make them appreciate this fact, that they should, before making a decision, perhaps learn more about what language education is and what its value is for students in general. We need to remember, as we do advocacy, that administrators are not always influenced by objective factors. So it's not just a matter of presenting data. Often they are influenced by their own intuitive stance towards foreign languages, which is often a throwback to their own experience. So if they had a bad experience in college, they're not going to be particularly well disposed towards a foreign language. So it's our job also to correct the oftentimes erroneous image of institutional decision makers might have of education, of language education. And we need to advocate for our current instructional practices, not the way they remember they were taught 40, 50 years ago. This includes not only higher administration, but other structural decision makers. And we tend to forget about them. We tend to think that if we talk to the dean and the dean agrees, everything will be fine. We need to talk to advisors and other mid-level administrators because they're the ones who often help students make decisions about whether to take a language or not, or to take this language as opposed to another. One of the things I do every year is I meet with an advising corps in Columbia. And I tell them, please stop encouraging students to test out a language. Please stress the importance of language for them, even if they can test out of a language. Tell them to take another language. Because if you are pushing them to take the easy way out, most of the students will do that. Talking about that, before I go on, some of the other data that I've started gathering in Columbia, and I would urge you to do this, is I'm talking to the language departments to see how many students as a percentage are testing out of the language, and have they kept the data historically. I want to see if more students are testing out. How many students are coming with advanced AP placement in certain languages and testing out? What percentage of students are continuing despite the fact that they've tested out of the language requirement? This is important data. A lot of the students who take less commonly taught languages at Columbia come from my center. One of the things we started doing this year is we started asking students who decided not to take the language, so they signed up and then dropped the language. Why did you drop the language? So we reach out to them. Was it the scheduling? Was it the fact that you thought the language was too hard? Was it the fact that you decided to do something else? We need to know this. Otherwise, we're just shooting in the dark. Okay? So before you advocate, you need to pick up information. You know this, some of you who have done advocacy, warning, you need to start early. You need to start advocating before the problem has become a problem. You really need to, start early. And you don't want to dilute the message. You want to talk about one thing and one thing only. Like I said, if you're reactive and you wait until the situation has become critical, chances are that decisions have already been taken. So you want to head them off at the pass. The last thing I will say is one of the things that seems to appeal the most to the administration, the administrators I talk to, is when I can make an argument for how language education at Columbia aligns with the institutional strategic goals and priorities. So you need to know what the strategic mission of your institution is. You need to know what the vision of your institution is. There are a number of buzzwords that have been going on in Columbia in the last 9 years. You need to know what these buzzwords are. And you need to show how what you're doing and what the language programs are doing are actually aligned with these strategic goals, strategic mission, and buzzwords. Otherwise, you're talking a countercurrent, and you're not going to get any traction. So, information, advocacy, innovation. I'm going to continue to speak as an economist, and I will say that the crisis that we're facing today is as much related to the product we are selling as it is to our inability to make that product worth buying. What do I mean by this? What the data is telling us, the historical data, is that students are deserting the language ship in significant numbers, and they're saying in a louder and louder voice with their feet that they're not finding much value in what we have to offer. This should make us stop and think. If we're to reverse this trend, it is incumbent upon us to take action and complement our information and advocacy campaign with concrete steps that reassess our methods and changes the substance and structures of our program in order to make language learning a more desirable activity for a greater number of students. There's not always a very good match between demand, that is, what students are saying they want, and what we are offering them. You can't go in my university with a language that will go unmentioned. Teaching a course for social studies or social scientists, which is packed, they have to turn down students every semester. And then all of a sudden the department decides that they're going to offer a course in medieval poetry. And then they're wondering why they can't get more than 2 students to register for the course. We're not offering something that the students want. Okay? That's what this is telling us. So we need to offer things that students are looking for. Our success or failure will largely depend on the extent to which we can become agents for change and can respond strategically to the increasingly hostile scrutiny that language instruction is receiving from both students and administrators. So we need to tailor our programs to our student goals and objectives and find the right balance between encouraging the study of language, literature, and culture and increase opportunity to help our students find the best suited and most exciting use of the target language in the content area of their choice. Not every student who studies a language wants to study literature. That's another way of saying this. We need to hear this. When you increase opportunities for students in a language, then you give your program a chance to grow. Here are some suggestions for a transformation of the language curriculum. That could include more project-based learning, greater focus on heritage language education. I'll start with that one. We know that the number of heritage students is growing. More and more of us are finding heritage students in our classes. We need to provide opportunities for these students, opportunities for them to value a language they already know and a desire to go deeper into that language. We need to focus on project-based and experiential learning experience. Students want to do something with the language. They want to go out, they want to connect to a community, they want to connect to a community where that language is used. They want to do something that they find is socially beneficial to them and to others. I have a degree in medieval poetry. I like that, but I understand that a lot of people, it doesn't rock their boat. I understand that. I understand that a lot of people want to work in social work, in public health, in sustainable development. They want to do archival work. Okay. We need to make sure that we're offering courses that prepare them to do what it is that they want to do. One of the most successful courses I taught at Columbia lately has to do with the relationship between language and space. Students want to go out and explore the city. They want to explore urban environment. They want to explore language in space. Okay. We should increase service-based learning. Our students want to serve. They're very idealistic. They want to do good. They want to serve the community. They want to be able to make a difference. And we need to help them do that, especially in places where there are perhaps underserved communities that would benefit to working with our students. We need to focus on languages for specific purposes. When we talk about arguments about the value of learning a foreign language, we sometimes overlook the key term, value. Okay. For many students, learning another language is done as much for practical purposes as it is to engage deeply with another culture and a different literary tradition. We have to be careful that we don't empower a narrative that reduces language learning to a reductive exercise, so language as a tool. Nonetheless, it would be a mistake to resist the call to incorporate courses in a broader language curriculum that stress the practical skills that many students value. Consequently, I think that any reform, any curricular reform, could and should include more languages for specific purposes, Spanish for medical purposes, Spanish for dental purposes. We have a course on Haitian Creole for newly arrived immigrants in New York. Legal courses, various legal people who work with incoming communities. We need to offer more of this. We need to incentivize advanced study. Remember I said that less and less students are taking advanced courses. So we need to find ways institutionally to incentivize advanced studies. An example here would be Yale's new Certificate of Advanced Proficiency. So it's a certificate they give to students that take courses beyond the language requirement. Our students, at least I know at Yale and Columbia, they collect certificate like candy. So the moment you offer a certificate, they will do something. I'm going to skip over the other areas that we need to do innovation. I'm not going to say anything about structural and curricular reform. It's sad that the 2007 MLA report has not really been followed, but the transformation of languages department needs to occur at some point. There's very few departments that have followed the recommendation of the report. Until you do this, you're going to continue to have these problems. We also need to pay more attention to professional development. If we want our faculty to be able to offer innovative courses, we want them to attract students with more innovative ways of teaching, we need to help them develop as professionals. We need to send them to conferences, we need to teach workshops for them, we need to provide them with the opportunity to grow as professionals and human beings. The last thing I will talk about is collaboration. To thrive in tomorrow's environment, language programs have to be prepared to change, and I strongly believe that collaboration can be a crucial lever to enact fundamental change in who we are and what we do. In my opinion, fostering a culture of cross-institutional collaboration will have to become a priority in higher education in a not-too-distant future. But it's not going to be easy for this idea to get a hold in our current institutional landscape. Fundamentally, collaboration means thinking across boundaries and joining forces with partners in order to find innovative solutions to common challenges. However, with the notable exception of a small number of efforts. The vast majorities of colleges and universities continue to operate today within a culture that portrays each academic mission as distinctly unique. The prevailing view is that all relevant expertise can be, and in fact should be, found locally on one's own campus. Accordingly, most colleges and universities are conditioned to see their peers more as competitors than as potential partners. And this entrenched mindset makes it difficult for collaborative initiatives to emerge and be successful. However, collaboration can be and is a powerful vehicle to establish course and program sharing initiatives that leverage resources and expertise amongst a number of partner institutions in order to increase academic offerings, expand curricular choices, and make more efficient use of existing local resources. I'll mention a number of them. The one I know the best is the Shared Course Initiative. It's an initiative that tried to bring a collaborative ethos to the teaching of the Lictals. It was established in 2012 with the help of Mellon. It's a collaboration between Yale, Cornell, and Columbia that uses high-definition video conferencing to synchronously connect classroom across the 3 sites and supplement local face-to-face offerings with language instruction delivered via distance. We had 6 years of support from Mellon. We were successful enough that now this has gone into the hard budget of our institution. So we've transitioned from soft money to hard money. And when I talk about the transformational power, the way we think of Lictals now in these 3 institutions are through a collaborative mindset. We no longer think about offering language only on our own campus. The moment we set up a Lictal program, we immediately think of the other 2 partners. There's been other shared model of instruction for language study. They're starting to gain momentum in a wide range of institutional contexts, the Big Ten Alliance, the New York 6 partnership, the 5 colleges, the Lictal partnership at MSU, the University of Chicago Lictals, the Great Lakes. It is the future. We no longer should think of ourselves as islands in the stream, individual islands. We need to start thinking collaboratively as groups of institutions that work together to offer something to a growing group of students. Let me also point out, in a completely different context, the groundbreaking work of Coral as a center that seeks to promote a culture of collaboration in the creation and usage of open educational resources. So I think, as we move forward towards the future, we do need to think about collectively partnership rather than start to think individually. If we think individually, we're just going to continue to reproduce what we've known up to now. We need to change our mindset and start thinking about how do we go forward collaboratively together. I want to conclude with a few reflections on the notion of crisis. People are always talking to me about the language crisis. We're accustomed to thinking of language education as being in crisis. It's a term that comes over and over again to describe the situation we're witnessing today. Conventional wisdom would say that language education in the U.S. is in crisis. But I'm not sure if the word crisis is well chosen. In my opinion, the rhetoric of crisis, in fact, serves more to obfuscate and to hide the current state of affairs, rather than allow for an accurate diagnosis. After all, those of you who speak French, you know that the word crisis is used to describe an acute situation, something that flares up suddenly before subsiding again. In French, we talk about une crise de foi, une crise d'épilepsie, une crise de nerfs, something that's temporary, and then it goes away. The implication is that the organism returns to a state of normalcy after the predicament has subsided. In other words, everything will be fine after the crisis is over. With this in mind, I would argue that the word crisis is not an appropriate metaphor to characterize the situation we're experiencing today in the field of language education in the US. The radical shift in enrollments the data points to is not a sudden explosive crisis characterized by the emergence of a unique set of circumstances, but is rather the latest manifestation of an ongoing systemic set of long-standing structural issues. Already in 1997, Richard Lambert had identified a quote-unquote quiet crisis in the field of language education. I'll remind you that even in the glory days, the golden age, the top of the ladder, we're talking about 16 students out of 100 taking languages. That's the golden age we're looking back at. Okay. So I think it's incumbent upon us to try to look beyond the rhetoric of crisis if we are to begin to develop an effective response that successfully addresses the lack of interest or achievement in foreign languages in the US today. It's here perhaps that I'll talk about the second meaning of the word crisis. Those of you who have some knowledge of Greek, I'm also half Greek, you'll know that the word is derived from the original Greek verb that means to decide, krino. And apart from describing a period of intense difficulty, the word also refers to a time when an important decision has to be made. We are, I believe, at such a junction. If we are to go beyond the current crisis, it's imperative that we find ways to deal meaningfully with the situation that confront us and determine a clear path forward as a community. Otherwise, I'm very much afraid that the current state of affairs will grind on into the foreseeable future until, in the end, we will wake up one day and find that we have become almost totally irrelevant to the entire enterprise of higher education. Let me finish by saying that we need to accept that there are no quick fixes. We should not expect the number of enrollments to dramatically increase overnight. Bringing about change takes time, but it's a challenge that we should face with courage and convictions. There are some optimistic signs on the horizon. The demographics in this country are changing. There's been an increase of 150% in people who say they speak another language at home. So obviously, because of immigration, because of bicultural marriages, more and more Americans are starting to speak another language at home. We see this trend. The challenge is, how do we transform this into opportunities for language learning at the formal level? So despite all the negativity that I've been giving you, I remain optimistic that, for those of you who speak Greek, I remain optimistic that there are ways forward. And I hope that we can work at them together to try to find solutions that lift all boats. Thank you.